I never imagined that the day I had been dreaming about since I was a little girl could be ruined by something as absurd as a neighbour's party. When people talk about weddings, they describe love, family, maybe the nerves of saying, I do. But no one ever warns you about how fragile everything feels when you're standing on the edge of your perfect day. I remember waking up that morning with a mixture of butterflies and exhaustion because I hadn't really slept. My dress was hanging by the window, the lace catching the soft sunlight, and my maid of honour was already in the kitchen making coffee. Everything felt calm for a moment, too calm now that I think back on it, because across the fence, on the other side of our yard, my neighbours were hauling in speakers the size of refrigerators and coolers stuffed with beer. At first, I brushed it off. I told myself, maybe it's just a small get-together. People have parties on weekends, right? But the more I peeked outside, the more my stomach started to twist. Trucks kept arriving, people unloaded cases of alcohol, and someone even dragged out a rented karaoke machine on my wedding day. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, that maybe they didn't realise what today was for me, but deep down I knew they had been hostile ever since we moved in. Not outright cruel, but the kind of neighbours who would roll their eyes at our guests, complain about parking, slam doors just a little too loudly. I used to laugh it off, telling my fiancé that maybe they were just bitter. He'd kiss my forehead and say, "Forget them. This is our home." That morning, though, all I could think was, why today of all days? I tried to shake it off. I sat with my mum as she zipped up my dress, my hands trembling against the beaded fabric. She whispered, "You look beautiful." And for a second, I believed nothing could touch me. But then the bass started, the kind of bass that rattles windows and makes water glasses tremble on the table. It was barely noon. The ceremony wasn't until 3, but already I felt panic creeping in. My dad noticed my face pale and asked what was wrong, and I didn't even want to say it out loud because it sounded ridiculous. My wedding? Destroyed by a party next door? Who would believe me? I remember trying to stay positive, telling myself maybe they'd keep it down later. I forced a smile, posed for pictures, held my bouquet tight, but every time the photographer told me to tilt my chin, all I could hear was someone next door shouting into a microphone, laughing like they were mocking me. Even my bridesmaids exchanged worried glances. I could feel my dreams slipping, and all the while I kept thinking about how this was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. By the time the ceremony began, I was already on edge. We had planned everything to be in the backyard, under the big oak tree that had always been my favourite spot since moving into the house. I pictured fairy lights twinkling in the branches, the white chairs lined up neatly, the sound of soft music as I walked down the aisle. For months I had closed my eyes at night and imagined that walk, holding my father's arm, seeing my fiancé waiting with that nervous half-smile he always had. But instead of violins, the soundtrack to my wedding was pounding bass and drunken laughter. At first, when the officiant cleared his throat and started the ceremony, I tried to block it out. I forced my eyes to lock on my fiancé's face, telling myself that nothing else mattered, and for a fleeting second, it almost worked, but then someone on the other side of the fence screamed the lyrics to a karaoke song so loudly that half of my guests turned their heads in shock. I felt my cheeks burning. I gripped my bouquet so hard that the stems bent. The officiant tried to continue, raising his voice, but it was almost comical. Us trying to have sacred vows, while next door it sounded like a rowdy bar on a Friday night. My grandmother, who had travelled hours just to be here, kept cupping her ear and leaning toward my mother, asking what was being said. I wanted to cry, but the camera was on me. I kept thinking, this will be in the video forever. My "I do" drowned out by a neighbour's drunken version of a pop song. My husband squeezed my hand, whispering, "Ignore them, baby, it's just noise." But it wasn't just noise, it was my moment being stolen. I remember one guest, my cousin, even tried to yell over the fence, telling them to lower the volume, but they only turned it louder as if to prove a point. That was when it hit me that this wasn't an accident. They knew, they were doing it on purpose. The ceremony limped along, and I barely remember the words I said. I felt detached, like I was watching some cruel parody of my own wedding. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, people clapped, but even their clapping seemed overshadowed by the thumping bass and the shouts of cheers from next door. And when my husband kissed me, instead of tears of joy, I felt tears of frustration welling up. I wanted to scream. All my planning, the money spent, the vision of my perfect day. It was slipping away and there was nothing I could do. As we walked back down the aisle, guests smiling, petals flying in the air, all I could hear was someone belting out a drunken laugh, like the universe itself was mocking me. After the ceremony, we moved into the reception, and I had clung to a shred of hope that maybe, somehow, things would settle down. The catering staff brought out trays of food. The cake was wheeled to the corner under its delicate cover, and the DJ we had hired tried his best to start the evening with soft romantic music. For a short moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, the neighbours would tire themselves out. But the exact opposite happened. As soon as our first dance began, they cranked their speakers higher. The bass thudded so violently through the ground that I could feel it under my shoes as I tried to sway with my new husband. I wanted to rest my head on his shoulder and forget everything, but the moment was tainted by roars of laughter and the clinking of beer bottles smashing together. It was as if they had studied the schedule of our wedding and planned to sabotage every special moment. I remember glancing around the yard. My guests were trying to smile, trying to pretend nothing was wrong, but I could see it in their faces. My aunt's polite smile tightened at the corners. My bridesmaids kept exchanging uncomfortable looks. Even the children who were supposed to play near the photo booth stood still, covering their ears. At one point, the DJ tried to raise the volume of our music to compete, but it only made everything sound like a chaotic battle of noise. It was unbearable. My mother walked up to me and whispered, "Do you want me to go talk to them?" But what could she have said? They already knew. They had chosen this. I shook my head and forced a smile for the cameras. My husband tried to joke, saying, "At least we'll never forget our wedding," but it landed flat. It wasn't funny, it was cruel. The photographer asked us to cut the cake next, and as we held the knife together, the neighbour's karaoke machine blared a drunken rendition of a love song so off-key that half the guests cringed. My perfect cake-cutting photo would forever be framed by noise and mockery. I felt like my stomach was in knots. All the little moments I had dreamed about, the first dance, the toasts, the laughter around the tables, they were being drowned in someone else's selfish celebration. What hurt most was the way my guests tried to cover for me, acting like they didn't mind, but I could feel their pity. I didn't want pity. I wanted joy, and yet I couldn't find it. My memory of that night is a blur of smiling through tears, nodding at speeches I could barely hear, and watching the shadows of my neighbours dancing wildly against their lit-up backyard, as if they were mocking us with every move. When I went to the bathroom to breathe for a moment, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. My makeup was still intact, but my eyes were red. I barely recognised the bride staring back. When it was time for the speeches, I prayed silently that the universe would grant me just a few minutes of peace. My father stood, holding the microphone with shaky hands, his eyes already glassy with emotion. He had rehearsed his words for weeks, I knew, and he wanted this moment to be special. He began speaking about how he remembered me as a little girl, running around the backyard in a tutu, dreaming about this very day. For a second, my heart softened, and I thought maybe his voice would carry louder than the chaos next door. But almost instantly, the neighbours erupted into a chant, drunk and rowdy, banging on pots and pans as if to create deliberate noise. My father's voice trembled, not from nerves, but from trying to fight against their shouting. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, straining to hear, but I saw their eyes flickering with discomfort. My dad's speech, the words he had poured his soul into, was being stolen from me. I wanted to scream, to jump over the fence and shut it all down myself, but I stood frozen, clutching my champagne glass so hard I thought it might break. Then it was my maid of honour's turn. She started her toast by recalling our college years, the late nights in the library, the promises we made to always be there for each other. Her voice cracked as she tried to stay composed, but every few seconds her words were interrupted by the neighbours shouting song lyrics or bursts of drunken laughter. At one point, someone yelled, "Turn it up!" and the bass grew so strong that the microphone in her hand screeched with feedback. I saw her bite her lip, trying not to cry. She had wanted her speech to be perfect, to show me how much she loved me, and instead she was battling a wall of sound. The guests clapped politely, trying to give her strength, but their applause was drowned too, and then it was my turn. I hadn't planned to speak long, just a few words to thank everyone for being there, to share how much it meant to me. But as I stood with the microphone in my hand, looking out at all those faces, I felt something inside me collapse. I could barely get 2 sentences out before a loud cheer from next door swallowed my voice. The humiliation was unbearable. I saw pity in their eyes again, and it cut deeper than any insult. I put the microphone down and whispered to my husband, "I can't do this." He squeezed my hand, trying to comfort me, but nothing could erase the fact that my wedding day had been hijacked. Even the children, who had been running around earlier, were now covering their ears or asking their parents if they could go home. My reception, the moment I had invested months of planning, thousands of dollars and countless dreams into, was turning into a nightmare. I excused myself, walking quickly toward the house, desperate for a moment of silence. Inside, the walls muffled the noise just a little, enough for me to finally let the tears fall. I pressed my hands to my face, careful not to ruin my makeup. But it was useless. I was broken. I could hear the muffled sound of the party next door through the windows, reminding me that even in my own home, I couldn't escape them. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed in my wedding dress, the lace pooling around me, while outside the chaos raged on. The muffled thumps of the bass seeped through the walls, shaking picture frames and rattling the glass on my nightstand. I had imagined sneaking away during the reception for a private moment, maybe to breathe, maybe to laugh with my new husband about how surreal everything felt. But instead, I was hiding. My maid of honour came in quietly, closing the door behind her, her face filled with worry. She sat beside me and wrapped her arm around my shoulders, whispering that no one blamed me, that everyone understood. But that was the problem. I didn't want understanding. I wanted joy. I wanted people to leave my wedding talking about how beautiful it was, not how awful the neighbours had been. I wanted my father's words to echo in their hearts, not be drowned in drunken shouting. I wanted my first dance to be remembered for romance, not the clash of 2 competing sound systems. My friend brushed a tear off my cheek and told me not to let them win, that the day was still mine. I nodded, but my heart wasn't convinced. Still, after a few minutes, I stood up, adjusted my dress, and forced myself back outside. The guests applauded softly when they saw me return, as if my presence alone might reset the evening. For a short while, I tried to throw myself into the party. I danced with my cousins. I smiled for pictures. I hugged my grandmother tight, but nothing could erase the constant noise pressing down on us. At one point, during the bouquet toss, one of the neighbours leaned over the fence, whistling and shouting crude comments that made my bridesmaids cringe. It was humiliating. The bouquet landed awkwardly because my throw was rushed, my mind distracted. Later, when the garter toss began, the neighbours banged metal objects together, chanting as though mocking our traditions. My husband tried to laugh it off, but I saw the anger in his jaw, the way he clenched his teeth. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon and the fairy lights flickered on, the tension was unbearable. My guests began leaving early, giving excuses like they had a long drive, though I knew they just couldn't take the noise any longer. Each goodbye felt like another nail in the coffin of the day I had dreamed about. My photographer pulled me aside and said he'd do his best to edit the pictures so the chaos wouldn't show. But I knew it would. You can't Photoshop disappointment from a bride's eyes. You can't remove the shadows of people glaring at a fence instead of smiling at the couple. I went inside again when the last of the guests trickled out, leaving only my parents and my husband. My mother hugged me tightly, whispering that she was sorry, as if she could somehow carry my pain for me. But there was no undoing it. My wedding day was over, and instead of joy, I felt robbed. Even as I slipped out of my dress and placed it carefully back on its hanger, the noise next door carried on, wild and unbothered, as though they had accomplished exactly what they wanted. That night, when the house was finally quiet and the neighbours' party had dwindled into the early hours of the morning, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. My new husband was beside me, already half asleep, exhausted from trying to hold everything together for my sake, but I couldn't close my eyes. The sound of the party still rang in my ears, like an echo of humiliation. I replayed every ruined moment in my head. My father's speech cut short by drunken shouting, my maid of honour's toast drowned in bass. Our first dance turned into a joke. It felt like my memories had been stolen and replaced with something grotesque. I had dreamed of watching our wedding video years later with our children, smiling as we pointed out familiar faces, telling them stories about that day. Now I dreaded even looking at the footage, afraid it would only remind me of what had been lost. Around 3 a.m, I got up and went to the kitchen for water. I looked out the window and saw the neighbour's backyard littered with bottles, chairs tipped over, the glow of their string lights still buzzing. They had celebrated without a care in the world, while my day crumbled into ashes. I felt a surge of anger so sharp it took my breath away. I thought about marching over there, banging on their door, demanding to know why, but I knew they would just smirk, maybe even laugh in my face. They had made it clear long before that they didn't like us. Small things had shown it. The way they would glare when our friends parked out front, the passive-aggressive comments about our renovations, the rolled eyes when we greeted them. But ruining my wedding wasn't just petty dislike. It was cruel. The next morning, my phone buzzed with messages from guests. Most of them were kind, telling me how beautiful I looked, how touching the ceremony had been. But between the lines, I read the truth. They were trying to comfort me, to soften the blow of what everyone knew had happened. My grandmother even left a voicemail, her gentle voice cracking as she said she wished she could have heard more of the vows. I sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through texts, tears dripping onto my coffee. My husband came in, still groggy, and wrapped his arms around me. "It's over now," he whispered, but it didn't feel over. It felt like the beginning of something bitter. Later that day, I caught sight of the neighbours lounging in their yard, laughing as they cleaned up, like they had no idea of the damage they caused. One of them even waved mockingly in my direction, and my chest tightened with rage. I knew then that I couldn't just let it go. Letting it go would mean letting them win, letting them walk all over me and erase one of the most important days of my life. Something inside me hardened, a quiet resolve forming at the back of my mind. They thought they had ruined me, but they had no idea what kind of storm they had awakened. The days after the wedding felt like moving through fog. Everyone else seemed to move on quickly, talking about how beautiful the dress was, how touching it had been to see us say our vows, how delicious the food tasted, but no matter how many compliments I received, I couldn't shake the bitterness lodged in my chest. I would sit in the living room with the wedding album proof spread across my lap, and instead of joy, I felt this hollowness. The photos looked perfect at first glance. Me in my gown, my husband smiling, the fairy lights glowing softly as the sun went down. But I remembered the truth behind every image. In the photo of my father giving his speech, I remembered how I couldn't hear his words. In the picture of me holding my bouquet, I remembered the neighbour shouting something crude over the fence. Every frame had a shadow the camera couldn't capture, but my memory never let go of. My husband tried to comfort me, saying things like, "We're married, that's all that matters," and I wanted to believe him. But it wasn't that simple. Weddings aren't just about the paperwork. They're about memories, about celebrating love with the people who matter most. Mine had been poisoned. A week later, when the photographer sent us a video preview, I couldn't even finish watching it. My smile looked forced, my eyes darting nervously as if I were bracing for the next interruption. I slammed my laptop shut and burst into tears. My husband put his arms around me, promising we could redo parts of it someday. Maybe renew our vows in a quieter setting. But the damage was already done. You can't redo your first wedding. That night, I stood by the window and watched the neighbours again. They were outside, laughing as usual, their music drifting faintly through the evening air, and all I could think was how they had walked away untouched while I was left with a wound that might never heal. The unfairness of it boiled in my veins. My parents had spent money to help us. My friends had travelled from far away, and all of it had been disrespected. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the people I loved, who had wanted to celebrate with me, and instead were forced to endure humiliation. That thought changed something inside me. It was no longer sadness I felt, but a quiet, simmering fury. I started noticing every little thing the neighbours did after that. The way their dog barked for hours, the way they left trash bags by the curb for days, the way they blasted music on weeknights. I began writing everything down in a notebook, documenting every disturbance, every slight. My husband thought I was being obsessive, but I told him I needed to do it. Maybe it was petty, maybe it was unhealthy, but I couldn't just sit by and let them erase what they had done. They had stolen something from me, and I wanted it back, or at least I wanted them to feel the weight of what they had taken. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew I would find a way. It didn't take long before I realised that ignoring them was impossible. Every time I stepped outside to water my flowers or take out the trash, the memory of that day came rushing back like a wound being poked open. The neighbours didn't even try to pretend they were unaware of what they had done. A week after the wedding, I was in my yard, collecting decorations we hadn't had the heart to pack away yet, when one of them leaned over the fence and said with a grin, "Heard you had quite the party." The way he said it, slow and mocking, sent shivers down my spine. I wanted to lash out, to scream, but instead I clenched my fists and forced myself to stay silent. They wanted a reaction, I told myself. They thrived on it, but inside my rage burned hotter. I started digging into local ordinances late at night, scrolling through pages of noise regulations, property laws, even homeowner association guidelines. I highlighted sections, saved screenshots, built a folder on my computer labelled evidence. My husband shook his head when he saw me hunched over the desk at midnight. "You're letting them live rent-free in your head," he warned. But it wasn't just in my head. It was my life, my memories, my home. I couldn't stand the idea that they could keep living carefree while I carried this scar. Soon I began timing their noise with a stopwatch, noting when the music started and when it ended. I recorded videos from our porch, capturing the thumping bass and shouting that went on well past midnight. Each clip felt like a small piece of power, proof that I wasn't crazy, proof that what happened on my wedding day wasn't just a fluke. Meanwhile, friends and family kept asking how married life was going, and I plastered on smiles, told them it was wonderful, but deep inside I was consumed by thoughts of revenge, of justice, of balance. I even dreamed about it sometimes, vivid dreams where I confronted them, where they finally felt humiliated the way I had. Those mornings I woke up with my heart pounding, my jaw tight, as if my body itself refused to let go. One evening, while I was out walking, I ran into another neighbour from down the street. She casually mentioned that the party next door had kept her awake too, that it wasn't the first time they'd disturbed the block. My ears perked up. I asked questions, careful not to sound too desperate, and she admitted that lots of people on the street were fed up. That conversation planted a seed. It wasn't just me. I wasn't alone. Maybe, just maybe, I could turn this from a personal grudge into something bigger, something that might finally force them to face consequences. I went home that night with a strange sense of energy buzzing in me. For the first time since the wedding, I felt like I wasn't powerless. I had an idea forming, and it gave me hope, and maybe even a little thrill. The idea grew quickly once I realised others had suffered from them too. I started talking quietly with the neighbours further down the street, sometimes when I saw them at the mailbox, sometimes while walking the dog. I kept my tone casual, but inside I was collecting information like puzzle pieces. Almost everyone had a story. Sleepless nights because of their loud music, trash blowing into their yards, rude comments shouted when people dared to complain. Some even mentioned calling the police in the past, only for the noise to stop just long enough to avoid a fine. That was when I understood their game. They knew exactly how far they could push the rules without getting into real trouble. But this time I wasn't willing to let it go. I suggested forming a small group, an unofficial alliance of sorts, to document everything together. At first, people hesitated. No one wanted direct conflict. But as I reminded them of all the ruined nights and disrespect, their frustration began to outweigh their fear. Soon enough, we had a shared folder online where we uploaded recordings, photos and notes. Every late-night shout, every overflowing trash can, every reckless firework, all of it was saved. My husband raised his eyebrows when he saw me so committed. "You're turning this into a full-time job," he joked. But he didn't understand. For me, it wasn't just about the noise anymore. It was about reclaiming control. Every entry in that folder felt like a step toward justice, a small way to take back what they had stolen from me. One Saturday afternoon, when the neighbours decided to blast music again, I sat on my porch with my phone, recording every second. I could see them glancing over, smirking, clearly aware I was documenting it. But instead of shrinking away, I met their gaze and held it. For the first time, I didn't look away. That night, I sent the file to our group, and within minutes, 3 other people had added their own clips from their homes. We were no longer just individuals annoyed by noise. We were witnesses building a case. Weeks went by, and slowly a thick stack of evidence piled up. Police reports, written complaints, videos, timestamps. I learned the process inside out, and the more I dug, the stronger I felt. Still, even with all this progress, I couldn't erase the pain of my wedding day. That memory stayed sharp, like glass lodged under my skin, but I channeled that hurt into determination. Sometimes, late at night, I would whisper to myself, "They will pay for this." And I meant it. Whether it was through official channels or something else, I didn't care. What mattered was that they didn't get away with it. Not after what they had taken from me. Eventually, the day came when all the frustration I'd been bottling up needed to spill over. It was mid-July, hot and sticky, and once again the neighbours decided to throw one of their infamous parties. I remember standing at my kitchen sink, looking out the window, watching them hauling cases of beer, and dragging another set of giant speakers into their yard. My chest tightened, my palms sweaty. It felt like déjà vu, like they were mocking me all over again. My husband told me to let it go, to close the blinds and watch a movie, but I couldn't, not after what had happened at my wedding. Not after months of documenting every insult and disturbance. This time, I was ready. I pulled out my phone, hit record, and walked outside onto the porch. The music thundered, laughter erupted, and I filmed every second. I knew the group of neighbours down the street were doing the same. It wasn't long before the volume climbed to an unbearable level, the kind that makes your chest vibrate, and I dialed the non-emergency police line. My voice shook as I explained the situation. But there was steel behind it. I wasn't just a frustrated bride anymore. I was a citizen demanding action. When the officers finally arrived, I watched from behind the curtain as they spoke to my neighbours. For once, I saw the smugness drop from their faces. They gestured wildly, trying to downplay things, but the officers weren't fooled. Too many complaints had piled up. After several minutes, the police ordered them to shut it down. The music cut off abruptly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the night was quiet. I stood there in the silence, my heart racing, a strange mix of relief and triumph washing over me. But it wasn't enough. A single night of peace couldn't erase the memory of what they had done. So I kept going. Our little alliance of neighbours grew stronger, and soon we filed an official petition with the city. Dozens of signatures lined the paper. Stories attached of sleepless nights and ruined events. I made sure my wedding story was at the top, written in detail, every humiliating interruption recorded. It wasn't just noise. It was cruelty. When I dropped that packet off at the city office, I felt a surge of pride. It was as if, finally, I was taking back my voice. Weeks later, a notice arrived that the city was investigating. The neighbours were warned of potential fines and restrictions. For once, the power shifted. My husband hugged me, telling me he was proud. But inside me the fire still burned. Justice was close, but I couldn't shake the need for more. I didn't just want rules to quiet them. I wanted them to feel, even for a second, the humiliation and helplessness they had made me feel. That thought haunted me at night, fueling dreams of revenge. And each morning I woke up, more certain that some kind of reckoning was coming. The investigation from the city brought some small satisfaction, but it didn't erase the bitterness inside me. Even when the neighbours kept their music down for a few weeks, I couldn't relax. Every time I heard their voices outside, every time I saw them carry bags of groceries or set up chairs on their patio, my body tensed like I was preparing for another attack. I realised I was living in a constant state of waiting. Waiting for the next offence. Waiting for the next humiliation. One evening, while sitting on the couch flipping through our wedding album again, I felt my chest ache. The images were beautiful but hollow, like photos from a party I hadn't truly attended. And that's when an idea came to me. Something more personal than city fines or noise complaints. If they could steal my peace, then I could steal theirs. I started small. I learned their routines. When they left for work, when they went to bed. I noticed their sprinklers ran on timers, so I adjusted mine to spray a little too far into their yard, soaking their chairs and patio cushions every morning. They tried to move the furniture around, but it kept happening. I never admitted it to anyone, not even my husband, but the tiny victories gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt since before the wedding. Soon I escalated. Whenever they left trash bags piled near the curb, I called the sanitation department, reporting them for improper disposal. When their dog barked at night, I filmed it and sent it to animal control, framing it as a nuisance case. Nothing huge, nothing that could be traced back easily, but just enough to keep them uncomfortable, to remind them that actions have consequences. Strangely, I felt lighter. Each time I sent a complaint or watched them scramble to deal with some inconvenience, a piece of the weight on my chest lifted. Some might call it petty, but to me it was justice, a slow drip of payback that made them feel at least a fraction of what I had felt on my wedding day. My husband started noticing my calmer demeanour, and he thought maybe I was finally healing. He had no idea that my healing came through quiet, calculated revenge. One night, lying in bed, I whispered to myself, "You won't forget me now." And I meant it. Every ruined cushion, every official notice, every small hassle was my way of carving my pain into their lives. They had taken a day I could never get back, but I was taking pieces of their peace day by day. Months passed, and my quiet campaign against the neighbours became almost a routine. They never confronted me directly, but I could sense their frustration growing. The sprinklers, the complaints, the endless small inconveniences. It all built up like an invisible wall, pressing against them. Their once loud weekends became subdued, their patio gatherings shorter, their laughter less frequent. For me, it was bittersweet. On one hand, I finally felt like I had control again. On the other, every time I sat alone with my wedding album, I was reminded that no amount of revenge could give me back the day I lost. My husband eventually noticed the subtle changes next door. One evening he asked, "Do you think maybe they've learned their lesson?" I looked at him, wanting to confess everything, but instead I just shrugged. Maybe they had, maybe they hadn't. What mattered was that I had. I had learned that silence can be just as powerful as noise when wielded the right way. I had learned that I wasn't as powerless as I felt that night, watching my vows drowned out by drunken laughter. One late summer evening, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset. The neighbours were outside too, but this time they were quiet, sitting around their table, speaking in low voices. The sight should have brought me joy, but instead it left me with an ache I couldn't ignore. Revenge had given me moments of satisfaction, but not peace. Peace was something I would have to choose for myself. I thought about my father's shaky voice during his speech, my maid of honour fighting tears, my grandmother leaning forward to catch every word. Those memories would never change, but maybe I could change the way I held them. Maybe instead of remembering the noise, I could remember the love behind those words, the effort behind the smiles, the people who showed up despite everything. That was the real core of my wedding, not the chaos next door, but the people who mattered. Still, I promised myself one thing as I finished my wine and stood up to go inside. I would never forget what they had done. Not because I wanted to live in bitterness forever, but because forgetting would mean erasing the lesson. My neighbours taught me how fragile joy can be, how quickly it can be stolen, but they also taught me that I'm stronger than I thought, capable of fighting back, of reclaiming pieces of myself in ways I never imagined. My wedding day was not what I dreamed of, but it became a different kind of story, one of loss, of anger, of small victories, and of a truth I'll never forget. Sometimes the people closest to you in distance can be the cruelest in spirit, and sometimes the only way to survive is to turn pain into power, even if it means carrying a scar you never asked for.